Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We're currently in Module 6, and this lesson we're going to be covering method overloading. Now, this is a little bit different than method overriding. So method overriding is when we replace a method with a different method of the same name and same signature in a child class. But in this case, we're going to do method overloading, which is different. All right, so let's open up Visual Studio, and we'll come down here and create a new project. And we'll create a console app.NET framework. We're going to call this method overload and method overload app. And make sure it's .NET Framework 4.7.2 and hit create. And in here we will add our console read line at the end. And now let's create a new class, public class person. And let's give it a few properties. So first name, last name, email. I think that's good enough for now. So there's our three properties for a person. And that represents one person. Now, if we wanted to create a constructor that was able to set these. Now we can do the trick of, let's just say var person equals, person model. There we go. Var person equals new person model and do our curly braces. We can do this. But what if you want to pass it in through the constructor? So you can kind of say, this is how you do it. Well, we can create a constructor. And we'll pass in the first name, the last name, and the email. Like so. And then we can say first name equals first name, last name equals last name, and email equals email. And that sets up those three values. And now I can pass those in. But what if I didn't have those yet? Right now, this constructor is forcing me to pass those three values in because otherwise it says you can't do that. Well, we do have the option of saying CTOR again and creating another constructor. And notice the error goes away up here. And we have two constructors with the exact same name, and yet it works. Well, why does it work? Well, this is called method overloading. And the idea behind method overloading is fairly simple. All it says is you can have two methods with the same name as long as their signature line is different. Now, a signature line is the name of the method, and it is what it returns. Well, in this case, it doesn't, excuse me. and string. And that's just the first 11. What this allows us to do is it allows us to use this write line method without really thinking about it. Because I can pass in a Boolean and it works. I can pass in an integer and it works. Because behind the scenes, there's multiple different versions of this console write line. Now here's the trick, and here's where you need to think about these overloads, is there's not the code for write line 19 times. These constructors call each other, or these methods call each other. So let's demonstrate that. So let's pare down our constructors here. Well, we can just minimize them. That'll work. That way you can still have them for your perusal later. Let's create a method here. So let's create an email generating method. So public void, we're just going to put it right into the email. First initial, we'll delete the dot out. And that takes care of the generate email. But now, what about the AOL? Well, we're going to create another one, where we pass in first initial method and we pass in the domain. Let's pass domain first. And then the first initial right there. And so then we grab this and we paste it in here. Like so. And we'll do it down below. And there. Now we have 4 different methods for generating email depending on which way we want to go. Now up here, when we say person, new person model, we could say, actually, let's pass in out in our constructor, Tim and Corey. And now we can say person.generate email, and I have 4 options. Let's start with the simplest one. And this time we're going to print out person.email just to see what it says. Let's run this. And it says tim.corey@aol.com. But if I were to pass in true and run this, now it says tcorey@aol.com. And if I say, well, actually I want true and gmail.com. It says, no, you can't do that because I passed it in the wrong order. So let's cut that out. We'll paste it in the correct order because order is important. And now it says tcorey@gmail.com. And if I set this to false and run it, now it's tim.corey@gmail.com. So there's all of my different options, and they all seem to work just fine. But notice the code down here is a lot of repetition. Now, I only have one line per. It's not like I have massive amounts of code, but at the same time, it's still repetition. And this is one of the dangers or downsides of method overloading is if you're not careful, you just create a whole bunch of repeated code. And that's not what you want. So instead, let's see if we can tighten this code up where we're not repeating ourselves nearly as much, if at all. So right now, I think this is the most flexible method, meaning it passes a domain and the first initial method Boolean. So I'm going to leave this one alone and start calling it from other places. Let's go to the top. This one, we could say, instead of doing this, we can call generate email and say false. We don't want to have just a first initial. Actually, we want to pass in AOL first. So AOL.com and then false. Now, down here, we can pass in or call generate email and pass in the domain and false. We don't need to worry about this if statement here. We can just say generate email, AOL.com, and first initial method, and get rid of all this code. Now I have one method that does the actual work, and I have three methods that call that method, but with different configurations or different setups, so that I have all of my options available to me without having to specify everything. Now I can say if I want to pass the domain in or not. I can say whether or not I want to have the initial method, but I can come up here and just do the simple call of generate email, and it will still work the way it used to work. tim.corey@aol.com. That's the way it used to work. Still does. Now you might not always have the same code and just have it format a little differently. So this is a simplified version that really does work well together. But sometimes you may have different code behind these different methods, and that's okay. So you can have different code and the user doesn't have to care. All they care about is I'm asking for something and you're doing it. That's all that matters. Just know that internally you can call the other overloaded methods just like any other method. So that allows you to reuse your code very, very easily. All right, so that's really all there is to method overloading. It's a really helpful way to improve your code because you don't have a whole bunch of methods named almost the same thing. You can slim that down to one method with different options. You can also make sure you don't have a whole bunch of variables that have default values and checking if it's default. If it's default, then don't use it. And that gets messy. This allows you very, very clean in how you create your methods. Ask for what you need, and that's it. And then you can have another method that asks for a little more if there's a potential for that to be needed. Okay? So that brings us to our tip for this lesson. The tip is that overloads make things easier for the user. And the user meaning the developer who's using this code. Now, behind the scenes, just make sure you keep your code dry, as in don't repeat yourself. So make sure you're not repeating your code over and over again. Now you did see that I created those 4 methods and repeated my code and then went back and made the modifications necessary. That might be what you do, and that's okay. You can do that because that gives you a better idea of the whole picture about what's going on, not just either guesswork up front. That gives you a true picture of, oh, this is the repetition. Okay? So overloads, they make things easier for the next developer or even for yourself. Just make sure that your code is dry. All right, your homework is to create something very similar. Create an employee model and then create 3 different constructors that take in different amounts of data and actually wire it up and just get comfortable with the idea of overloading methods. It's actually pretty simple, but it's a really powerful thing to have in your toolbox. You want to make sure you know what you're doing. Okay? Once you're done that homework, then move on to the next lesson.